When I was doing the research, I saw a couple of reports. One of these reports is the Human Development Index report. So if you see, Human Development Index is consists of three things: health, education, and quality of life. That's how we define how developed the human beings are in that part of the world. So on that Human Development Index, our oops, is this switch off? Okay. So our anyway, so India is at a score of 0.64. That's an index, so score doesn't matter much. But what it does say is that we rank in the world 130th out of 189 countries. We are at 130th position. Now, if you look at the three components on health, as you can see there, there's again an index that I'll refer to. This index is called HAQ, Healthcare Access and Quality Index. On that, India features in the bottom quartile of the countries in the world. Again, you don't have to really know what exactly that means, but it tells you in the relative ranking way, where do we stand on the global scale. Next thing is education. Again, there's an index for that, which is good. Latest data I could find was for 2015. It says that we are at 112th position in the world when it comes on the education index. And the simple things, education index doesn't mean a lot. It just means access to education, how many people are enrolling in these schools, etc. It doesn't talk anything about rocket science and spacecrafts. It's very basic stuff. And the third thing is the standard of living. So the proxy for standard of living that I use is the poverty. And we all know, I think we all do, we have done great work recently in terms of improving the life of people and pulled up a lot of people above the poverty line, which is like $1.6 a day, so not a great amount of money we are talking about. But 25% or so of our fellow countrymen and women, they still live below the poverty line. So it doesn't say a lot about the quality of life either as a country. Healthcare, education, enough money to buy food, etc., are the ones where as a country we have failed. As a country we have failed for 70 plus years ever since we got independent. Why so? I have a very simple analogy which I love to use everywhere. 1973, many of you were not born that time, but there was a very famous film actor called Manoj Kumar. He came up with a movie called Roti, Kapda and Makan. In Hindi, Roti, Kapda or Makan. In English, it says just food, shelter and clothing. Three basic necessities. It was a very popular movie of that time, I realized later on. Even I was born after that. But it appealed to masses, appealed to people because it touched upon the reality. Those three were and unfortunately continue to be one of our basic flaws in our country where we don't have enough. But have we not done anything about it? If I ask that question to myself, my answer is no, we have done enough. We have tried enough, I should say. And time and again, we keep hearing this free, that free. So giving free houses, giving free water, giving this free, that free. So we've been trying to do that. The problem I see with that is that we are just providing roti, kapda or makan. We are not making people capable enough to earn it for themselves. At least we are not doing it fast enough. At least we are not doing it with as many people as we need to do. So that's where the dichotomy starts. So while we know these three things are important, and we are trying to provide those, but we are trying to provide those. We are not trying to really enable and empower people to really earn those for themselves. If I don't agree with that, then what do I agree with? And if I think this is wrong, then what do I think right is? So it got me into thinking, what is education? And there are many stereotypical ways to define education. How many degrees I have? How many years of education did I receive? What kind of school did I go to? What was my CAT score, by the way? What was my GMAT score? So these are the things which define how educated I am. Okay, maybe they're not wrong in their place, but I think they are just some indicators that we can look at. What I believe, and I sincerely think many others do, is that education is a way of life. Education is a journey. It's where we all go through the life, the experiences that we gain, the education we receive in schools, by the way, what we learn in colleges. If somebody learns to make a spacecraft and take people from one place to other, fine, that's part of education too, but that's one part of the education. That is not the education. Unfortunately, I think many of us in the society, because of conventions, trying to define that as education. What is missing out is the way of life. What is missing out is the experiences that we can gain. What is missing out is what we can do something about what we have learned, other than what my job is, other than what my means of livelihood is. So that's where I see a dichotomy, and that's where I think we need a broader definition of what education is and how we address that problem then. But this is my definition of learning, education, as I was saying, where there's a continuous process goes throughout the life. It's an ongoing process. It's a process of social transformation of a human being, in which our experiences, education, everything plays a role. And this is something, when we say I've learned enough and we stop doing this, at that stage, this machine stops. And when that machine stops, your product is finished. So wherever you decide to stop, your product is finished. You better keep on going on that machine for as long as you can. And well, there's a lot of data. Back in 1965, they studied the you can say the school enrollment rates in East Asia and Pacific region, basically Australia, Japan, Korea, that region. And on the other hand, they looked at the North Africa, Central Africa countries, and they looked at what was the enrollment rate there. And then they followed that up for a good 40 plus years. So when they started off, both these countries had a certain growth rate of their GDP per capita. And when they ended this, they again had a certain growth rate that was there. So from where they started off, East Asia and Pacific grew by 3.5. They grew at the rate of 3.4% every year. CAGR, simple CAGR for the per capita GDP. Whereas in East Africa, it grew in 0.6% or 0.7%. So there's a remarkable difference out there. And you know what? The only thing that they found in parallel which was relevant was access to education. The number of people who were enrolling to schools and who were able to complete their high schools and get into secondary schools. So there's a strong correlation there, and data proves it. We don't need data for that, but those who seek for data, even data says that there's a correlation between those two things. So education does drive economic growth. So changing track a little from economic growth, let's talk about women empowerment. And it's very, very important because this is related to economic growth eventually. What I want to establish is a connect between the education, improvement in education, quality of education, access to education, and the women empowerment. And it's not very difficult to understand. What I pick up are very simple matrices. Child mortality. India, we have one of the highest, still unfortunately, one of the highest under 5 mortality rate in the world, which means children below 5 years of age dying because of the preventable disease conditions. It's very, very high. And the country is Nigeria, where we have the same problem. And again, the analysis suggests that if up to grade 12, education is made mandatory, 1.17 million lives a year can be saved because of that. Maternal deaths. Every day, 800 women in our country die during childbirth, even today. That's a huge number of people we lose every day, again, to preventable disease conditions like postpartum hemorrhage, nothing like bleeding during childbirth or infections after the childbirth. All very, very preventable conditions. That can be prevented if there is basic education about menstrual hygiene, about family planning, and things like those is available. Not college degree, not +2 degree, it's education about those things. And thirdly, the discrimination. I don't have to say anything about that. As a society, I think we have trained ourselves enough to create barriers everywhere. And one of the largest and the most difficult to breach barrier we have created is the men versus women kind of discrimination. If women get educated, they will make sure the entire families get educated. So it cannot be overemphasized how women empowerment will eventually help us. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. The only third thing I want to establish is a connection between education and our own environment. I say this because I live in Gurgaon. I think most of us live in here in Delhi NCR region, and we know what AQI right now is, air quality index. We don't even have machines to measure AQI in 4 digits, and we are reaching those levels. It's insane what we can do to ourselves, what we can do to our surroundings, but we are doing that. And I think to a large extent, education or rather the lack of education about certain things is what is to blame for that. So very quickly moving on, and this is where I think the most of my points lead to is, if we know this, if I know this, if some of you know this, if we can find this out on internet, if I could find this out, some of these data points on internet in the last 4 days, then for sure we can do something about it. And if I can think of doing that, I'm sure there are millions of others who can think of doing that as well. Why are we not able to do that? Why we are failing collectively on that? I want to say collectively because it's not one individual, it's not one politician, it's not one policymaker. Collectively, as a group of people, we are failing on ourselves. So what's leading to that? Some quick notes on that. Very first one, my favorite one. You know how much do we spend on our education in our country? It's 4.3%. Some would argue 4.6%. I read that debate, but let's say 4.6 for the argument's sake. Again, is that good or bad? From an outcome point of view, you know it's bad. They studied that in 2016, how did the states spend their education budgets? Very simple thing. So, and they picked up on those 12 where the disparities were the largest. And of those 12, 11 states did not even spend what was already budgeted for healthcare. So if my argument is about scarcity of resources, we don't even know how to use them, right? So there were states like Odisha and Jharkhand and others who spent less than 50% of their allocated budget for education. And it doesn't give me a great pride in saying how Delhi fared. Delhi spent 63%. So 37% of the allocated education budget from Delhi stayed unutilized. So the last thing we should be crying about is we don't have resources. We don't know how to use those resources, right? And outcome is a clear indicator again. Just look at the research output from the country. I mean, we produce only 3% of the research on earth as a data point. And of that, more than 90% comes from the top 30 institutions in the country. Disparity, do we understand? Last point on disparity, very, very interesting thing. There's a state in India which is known for producing engineers, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. There's a state in India which is known for producing nurses, Kerala. And there's a state in India which is known for producing government employees. Now what makes it happen? Can't these people become nurses or can't they become engineers? Stereotypes. Yahi karna hai, aise hi karna hai. And that's where the problem is. Education is the key. I want to say this, girl child dropout, because I talked about women empowerment earlier. I talked about how improving the women education rates can actually help us. 33% of the girls that drop out of the school, of all those who get enrolled in schools, so I'm not even counting the ones who never enrolled in the school. Of those, 33% drop out by the time they reach grade 9. That number rises up to 57% by the time they go to grade 11. And that goes possibly beyond 75% by the time we reach grade 12. You know what are the factors driving that? We can talk about resources, school nahi hai, paisa nahi hai, all those things keeping aside. What drives that? Number one, menstruation. It's a big taboo in our country. As soon as a girl reaches the stage of puberty, parents will take her back. One is, people don't know about menstrual hygiene, but the second thing is there's a big taboo attached to that. So girl cannot just go around. And the second thing is, अब तो लड़की शादी के लायक हो गई, so now she has to get married. I'm not talking about Delhi. Delhi also maybe these stereotypes still exist, but if you go to the real India that stays outside of Delhi, these are the real problems there. And as a healthcare professional, I have dealt with those in my previous life, and as an education education industry person, again I deal with those problems here. And this is all real stuff. Just imagine, more than 60-65% of the girls don't even reach grade 12. And only we could make that sure, we could save those 1 million lives. Diversity in education, just 2 points. You know what is the proportion of girls in IITs? The girl students in IITs? 8% it is. Very healthy 8%. Next point. Do you know what's the proportion of women as education leaders in our country? Deans, directors, vice chancellors. So we've got 840 odd higher education institutions that we track. That number is 6.8%. Only 6.8% of those education leaders in our country are women. Discrimination, somebody said? It just can't be natural, right? It just can't be natural. There are those old boys clubs where only boys can, get entry. We need to break these stereotypes. Can we transform? Can we address these points? And as As I said, I personally think we can address all those points. We can address all those points. We can actually empower people. We can give them a way of life if we address all these points. And once people know what they have to do, once people have access to the resources, once people have access to people, I think innovation is a natural process that happens. And I'll end with a very old saying. And interestingly, I read a debate where the origin of that saying is. Some people even claimed India. I don't know. Mostly people said Japan, some said somewhere in Europe. Wherever it came from, it's a very meaningful thing. All it says is, if you give a man a fish, you know what I'm saying? You give him a fish for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you give him fish for his life. And that applies to all of us. Learning is a lifelong process. It's a way of life. We need to keep on fishing. We need to keep on, improving our skills on fishing and others as we go along. And if we are able to do that as a nation, if we are able to do that as a cohort, as a community, if we can bring in those changes in the society, on our culture, if we can break those stereotypes one after the other, I think it's all achievable. We can go to Mars, and hopefully one day very soon we'll land there safely, and we'll have our people from there, our robots rather, from there sending us the pictures. That's doable. Thank you so much.